Welcome to the Shahrazad Analysis Q&A, where we separate the original magic of the Arabian Nights from the creative liberties taken by 19th century translator Richard Burton, who apparently thought he knew Asia better than people who lived there. Tonight, we're diving into the tale of Shahrazad herself, the woman who told stories to save her life, and examining how Burton managed to turn a brilliant narrative into a Victorian fever dream of eroticism, awkward euphemisms, and colonial posturing. In this classical literature analysis series, we'll contrast his version with the more authentic Arabic text, highlighting what he left out or invented and discuss why those changes still matter today. Part 1. Burton's terrible translation. Question 1. Why do you think Richard Burton chose to use archaic, mock medieval English to translate the Arabian Nights? How does this choice affect the way readers perceive the stories? Burton wanted to create a sense of exotic antiquity, but the result was an adaptation of medieval English that made the tales sound alien and artificial. Instead of reflecting the straightforward prose of the Arabic original, his style imposed a fantasy filter that catered to Victorian taste for the exotic Orient. Question 2. In what ways does Burton's focus on sexuality and exotic detail distort the tone and intent of the original tales? While the Arabian Nights certainly include adult themes, Burton exaggerated and fixated on them. He added crude terms and wrote long footnotes on sexual practices, which shifted the stories from Shahrazade's clever survival narrative into a voyeuristic spectacle. This distortion reinforced Western stereotypes of the East as hypersexual and decadent. Question 3. Can we appreciate Burton's translation as literature, or should we primarily view it as a historical artifact of colonial attitudes? As literature, Burton's version is colorful and influential, but it should be read critically as a product of its colonial moments, steeped in Victorian Orientalism. That does not mean we should ignore its racist and sexualized framing. It means recognizing its impact and its flaws. Part 2. Orientalism. Question 4. How does Burton's portrayal of Arabs, Africans, and women reflect Orientalist stereotypes? Arabs are often portrayed as irrational, cruel, or sensual, Africans as monstrous and hypersexual, and women as unfaithful temptresses. These depictions are not faithful to the source material, but echo Orientalist tropes that cast West Asia as morally corrupt and other compared to the rational, civilized European West. Question 5. Edward Said argued the Orientalist works help justify colonial rule by portraying the East as exotic, irrational, and morally corrupt. Do you see evidence of this in Burton's translation? Absolutely. Burton's Nights fed the Victorian imagination with images of harems, lustful sultans, and treacherous women, reinforcing the idea that Eastern societies were decadent and needed Western authority or civilization. His translation was very much a colonial commentary. Question 6. How do Burton's lengthy voyeuristic footnotes contribute to the construction of the Orient as a site of sexual danger and fantasy? For those who have a version of the book that has Burton's footnotes, I left them out in the first episode. His footnotes had little to do with the story itself and instead digressed into descriptions of prostitution, homosexuality, or supposed Eastern perversions. These notes exoticize sexuality and suggested that the Orient was a place of dangerous, enticing excess, creating a distorted fantasy for his Victorian audience. These stereotypes still persist today. I have even experienced people who believe in these type of stereotypes today. When I was a soldier in Iraq, soldiers would see people of the same gender walking down the street, holding hands or with their arms interlaced and assume, oh, those guys are homosexuals, and knowing nothing about the culture, and that they were probably relatives, and unlike Americans, they have a really close relationship with their friends and their family. They can hug and kiss their family without it looking weird or awkward. And it's interesting to think about that, because the West sees them as the prudish culture, or the culture who is like very conservative, and that they see themselves as liberated, and they just project that onto other cultures who don't even really think about that stuff. It's like, this is my friend, or this is my little brother, and we're gonna walk down the street arm in arm. What of it, right? But yeah, these kind of things still persist today. There's always those men who fantasize about the veiled woman, what she looks like underneath all her conservative clothing and her veils. It's ridiculous, really, but these stereotypes have very much become a part of like the way people think of the Orient still to this day. Having never traveled there, and having never experienced or witnessed it, or knowing nothing of other cultures. Part 3, on colonialism and imperialism. Question 7. Burton produced his translation at the height of the British Empire. How might his work have reinforced Victorian ideas and cultural superiority? By portraying Western societies as decadent, immoral, and irrational, Burton's Arabian Nights translation subtly reassured his readers that the British Empire was justified in ruling over them. It confirmed Western superiority by presenting the East as exotic but fundamentally flawed. Just a note here, I do not like to call West Asia the Middle East. I'm one of those people who despise that term, because it implies that West Asia is an extension of the West, like the easternmost extension of the West, and it's not. West Asia is the westernmost extension of Asia. Their culture has nothing to do with Western European culture. It's a completely unique region of the world that's independent and capable on its own. It doesn't need the West. It doesn't need to be an appendage of the West. So this term just really irritates me. So I usually try to avoid using the term Middle East. And I think other people should start doing that too. It's not the Middle East of Europe. It's the West of Asia. Anyways, that's why I say West Asia, for anybody who's wondering. I know it sounds weird at first, but people need to get used to it. Question 8. To what extent can Burton's translation of Arabian Nights be read as part of a broader imperial project to control and define non-Western cultures? This translation actually fits squarely into that project. Translation wasn't neutral, it was a tool of empire. By framing the Arabian Nights through Orientalist stereotypes, Burton claimed authority over how Western readers would perceive Arab and Islamic cultures. It was a way of controlling the narrative. Question 9. Does Burton's attempt to shock Victorian readers with tales of Eastern sexuality reveal more about British obsessions than it does about West Asian culture? I believe it does. Burton's translation tells us more about Victorian anxieties and fascinations with sex than about the actual cultures of Asia. His emphasis on eroticism was less about authenticity and more about feeding his audience's curiosity and prejudices. Part 4. Modern reception. Question 10. How have modern translators like Husain, Haddawy, and Yasmine Seale challenged Burton's Orientalist framing of the Arabian Nights? Haddawy worked from the earliest reliable Arabic manuscript to strip away Burton's Victorian embellishments, giving readers a cleaner, more authentic prose style. Seale, as the first woman to translate the Nights, restores the poetry, nuance, nuance and cultural integrity, and re-centered Scheherazade as a clever, resourceful narrator rather than a pawn in a fantasy of decadence. Question 11. Why do you think Burton's translation remains popular in some circles despite its distortions and offensive content? I think because it's flamboyant, full of lurid detail, and has shaped Western pop culture's image of the Arabian Nights. People are drawn to its exotic style even if it's inaccurate. It's also often in public domain, making it widely accessible. Question 12. Do you believe it is possible to enjoy Burton's Arabian Nights today while also recognizing its colonial and racist underpinnings? Yes, but only with critical awareness. We can appreciate it as a historical artifact that influenced global culture while also being clear about its distortions and the harm of the stereotypes it spread. Reading it responsibly means not confusing it with authentic Arabic literature. Part 5 focuses on the Tale of Scheherazade itself. Question 13. How does Burton introduce Scheherazade compared to more authentic translations? I just want to point out that in my reading, this might not be reflected so much, which is why I encouraged people to get their hands on a copy of Burton's translation, because I revised his translation to make it more appropriate for YouTube. I don't know what exactly YouTube flags and things like that. So I wanted to make sure that my video wouldn't be, I don't know, tagged or something. I wanted to make sure that this analysis episode wouldn't get repressed in the algorithm. I'm new to YouTube, so I just wanted to make sure. So if you're going off of my reading in the previous episode, it's pretty watered down. So some of these questions might actually be based on Burton's translation in all of its stereotypical glory. Or it might also refer to the translators who are more true to the Arabic text too. It'd be nice if people could have access to each translation so they can compare and contrast them. But as for the reading, I wanted to do Burton's, but in a watered down way so it wouldn't cause any conflicts. So I'll read this question again. Question 13. How does Burton introduce Scheherazade compared to more authentic translations? Burton describes her with a barrage of archaic words and physical detail, emphasizing her beauty as wondrous, fair, a model of comeliness and symmetry of perfect loveliness. His tone feels almost voyeuristic, focusing on her body rather than her intellect, which is completely taboo in Islamic culture. In contrast, Haddawy introduces her more simply. She was well read and knew poetry, history, and legends of kings and peoples long past. As you can tell, he says nothing about her physical appearance in this phrase here. The emphasis is on her learning, wit, and wisdom, the qualities that allow her to survive. Burton's framing turns Scheherazade into a sensual object, while Haddawy restores her as a clever strategist. Readers of Burton see her primarily through an Orientalist male gaze, not as the resourceful heroine she is meant to be. Question 14. How does Burton translate Shahryar's reaction to discovering his wife's infidelity, and how does that shape the tale? Well, Burton's version is melodramatic. Shahryar cries, "Only in utter solitude can man be safe from the doings of this vile world. By Allah, life is not but one great wrong." His archaic diction and dramatic flourish make him sound like a tragic Shakespearean king. Haddawy's translation is more direct. He said to himself, "By God, this calamity is lighter than mine. My brother is a greater king than I, and yet this happens in his very place." It's straightforward, showing his reasoning rather than exaggerating. Burton's overwrought language makes the king's grief seem universal and inevitable. unfaithful, framing women as inherently untrustworthy, while Haddawy's version focuses on the human reaction and the moral reasoning behind the king's despair. Also notice how Haddawy translates Allah to God and Burton doesn't. This is often done by Western translators to divide and insist that Muslims don't worship the same God as they do, when in fact it is the same God. It's just that they call God Allah. That's their name for God. I think generally they do that on purpose. And what you get is a bunch of people who don't understand God in Islamic religion is the same God of Abraham in Christianity and Judaism. Something that also annoys me to no end. Okay, moving on. Question 15. Burton often describes women in the Arabian Nights as unfaithful or cunning. How does this affect how we perceive Shahrazade's mission? In Burton's version, the repeated idea that there never was nor is there a chaste woman upon the face of this earth sets up Shahrazade's task in a world where women are presumed deceitful by nature. Her storytelling becomes less about wisdom and more about proving an exception to a misogynist rule. In authentic translations like Haddawy or Seale's, the misogyny is present in Shahryar's worldview, but the text doesn't amplify it with Burton's moralizing tone. Instead, Scheherazade is framed as someone who uses intelligence, empathy, and skill to dismantle Shahryar's prejudice, not simply endure it. Burton reinforces harmful stereotypes of women, while more faithful translations highlight Shahrazade's active role in challenging those stereotypes. Question 16. How does Burton handle Shahrazade's first night compared to Haddawy or Seale? Burton writes with loaded archaic phrasing. Then the king arose and did away with the bride's maidenhead, and when it was midnight, Scheherazade woke and signaled to her sister. His use of did away with the bride's maidenhead is graphic yet oddly clinical, making her marriage sound like a ritual deflowering, reinforcing a sense of ownership rather than intimacy. Haddawy's translation, in contrast, that night the king slept with her. When midnight came, she woke her sister and asked her to request a story. Haddawy's translation, in contrast, it's concise, neither sensationalizing nor glossing over the reality. Burton's choice of words reflects a Victorian obsession with virginity and control of women's bodies. Isn't that ironic? Haddawy presents the scene as a simple fact of the narrative, letting the focus remain on Shahrazade's storytelling strategy rather than her sexuality. Question 17. Does Burton capture the suspense and rhythm of Shahrazade's storytelling? Burton's diction often bogs down the pacing with archaic flourishes like "tell on," "quoth the king," who chanced to be sleepless and restless and therefore was pleased with the prospect of hearing her story. The excess wording dulls the edge of suspense. Haddawy writes, "The king, who was unable to sleep, welcomed the story." Crisp and immediate, and builds tension without distraction. Burton's ornate style distances the reader, while more authentic translations let Shahrazade's wit and timing shine, reminding us her life literally depends on keeping the king engaged until dawn. Question 18. How does Burton's framing of Scheherazade affect modern readers' perception of her compared to Haddawy or Seale? Burton's Scheherazade is exoticized, a beautiful, obedient woman whose intelligence feels secondary to her role as a sexual partner. She is filtered through the Victorian male gaze. However, Haddawy and Seale's Scheherazade emerges as a narrator, philosopher, and strategist. She is witty, cultured, and deliberate, a woman who uses her intellect to challenge injustice. Modern readers of Burton's version may see Scheherazade as a romanticized Eastern beauty, while readers of Haddawy or Seale encounter her as a feminist icon centuries ahead of her time. Part 6. the morals of the stories. Let's analyze the true moral of certain parts of the Tale of Scheherazade that are more obvious in authentic translations and not Orientalist translations like Burton's. In the classic Arabic version of the tale, from the earliest manuscripts and the mainframe story of 1001 Nights, Shahryar does not explicitly tell his brother that he did the right thing by killing his unfaithful wife. Rather, after Shah Zaman confesses what he saw, Shahryar reacts with fury, declaring in effect that his brother escaped worse and affirming that infidelity is unforgivable. But he does not explicitly praise or morally endorse the act as right, as Burton translation suggests. Instead, Shah Zaman explains that witnessing his brother's calamity restored his own composure, and Shahryar responds with sorrow, rage, and then reflection, rather than simple approval of the act. Shahryar also doesn't tell his brother he would have slain 1,000 women if it happened to him in the original story. This could be a Western narrative to try to paint West Asian men as particularly violent and abusive or quick to anger. Another contrast in the original Arabic is that the woman who is the captive of the Ifrit is presented more matter-of-factly. She is clever, defiant, and even humorous in her cunning. Her actions aren't described with crude vulgarity. The actual tone in the original suggests commentary on the absolute futility and absurdity of absolute control and the complexities of human desire. In Burton's translation, the scene is heavily orientalized. He sexualizes the woman with lewd, sensational language, turning her into a hypersexualized caricature rather than a clever and defiant figure. He emphasizes her promiscuity in a way that feeds Western stereotypes of Eastern women at that time as lascivious and morally corrupt. This shift distorts the moral lesson into the prudent spectacle. And let's discuss this for a moment. Because you see, Western narrative is that West Asian men force their women to cover their bodies and such because they believe them to be incapable of fidelity, or they see them as over-sexualized beings who can't control their sexual desires and urges. This is what some Western people think when they think of women who wear the hijab. They look at it as their men controlling them for this reason. They don't see it as for what it really is that most women choose to cover themselves like this because they are modest, and modesty is a virtue according to their culture and religion, and it also represents their own autonomy over their body and that they control who sees their body. So there's always these distortions, and it's thanks to translations and stuff like this who have put ideas in their head instead of them asking actual Muslim women what it means to them, especially ones that choose to wear the hijab. They don't ask them, they assume based on stuff that they were fed. And now I'm not saying that sometimes it isn't forced in certain parts of the world, but this is a very extreme small minority of the Muslim world. Anyways, moving on. Question 19. What do you think the woman's imprisonment by the Ifrit symbolizes or means? And what does her deception actually symbolize and mean? The captive woman of the Ifrit was kidnapped and hidden away under the sea to ensure her chastity and loyalty, which symbolizes a man's need to control or be the guardian of woman's sexuality. However, she used her cunning and persistence to trick the Ifrit repeatedly, proving that brute force and control could not override her will. Question 20. How do Shahryar and Shah Zaman react to the women's infidelity? They are horrified, but also somewhat relieved, reasoning that if even a supernatural being cannot keep his woman faithful, then their own wives' betrayals were less humiliating. For Shahryar, this confirms his belief that no woman can be trusted. Question 21. What does the woman's insistence on collecting rings symbolize? The rings serve as trophies, a tangible record of her defiance and power over men, including kings and supernatural beings like the Ifrit. It's a reversal of the use of patriarchal narrative where men collect women. Question 22. How does this encounter explain Shahryar's later actions toward women? It provides the psychological trigger. He generalizes the women's behavior to all women, concluding that female infidelity is inevitable. This sets the stage for his murderous cycle of one-night marriages. Question 23. Could the Ifrit himself be seen as symbolic beyond being a supernatural captor? Yes, the Ifrit embodies male authority and control, overwhelming, supernatural, and possessive, but still unable to suppress female desire and autonomy. The tale suggests that no matter how powerful, control cannot replace genuine trust or love. The moral of this part of the tale is not that all women are deceitful, as Burton interprets it through his interpretation of Shahryar. Instead, in the authentic Arabic tradition, the story underlines that absolute control breeds rebellion. As the Ifrit's attempt to enforce loyalty through imprisonment utterly fails, the desire and human will cannot be chained by power, as the woman's cleverness outmatches brute force. And generalizing one person's behavior is dangerous. Shahryar's tragic misinterpretation leads to senseless, and Scheherazade's mission is to correct that view through her stories. In other words, the tale is a warning against paranoia, mistrust, and oppressive control, not proof of female treachery. Now let's dig into the tale of the bull and the ass, which Shahrazade's father, the vizier, tells her before she risks her life by marrying Shahryar. This one is fascinating because it's essentially a warning tale, since he's trying to scare her away from her dangerous plan. This tale is meant to show that interfering in dangerous matters, like Scheherazade's plan to fix Shahryar through storytelling, could end in disaster. The vizier hopes she'll take the lesson and abandon her dangerous plan. Of course, Scheherazade ignores the warning, which shows her courage and determination. In the authentic Arabic translation, the tone is didactic, straightforward, and moralistic. The tale functions as a serious warning, emphasizing patience, humility, and the dangers of unnecessary interference. The animals speak with wit, but not vulgarity. In Burton's translation, heavily full of Orientalist flourish, he embellishes the animals' dialogue with crude humor and exaggerates the donkey's slyness, sometimes adding suggestive remarks. The rooster's language and behavior is also way more lewd and crude instead of matter-of-fact. His version makes the tale seem almost like comic relief, undercutting the original cautionary tone. For example, in Haddawy's version, the ass simply advises the bull to feign illness. In Burton's version, the language becomes more mocking, making the ass seem bawdy and the bull pitiful in a way that's meant to amuse Western readers rather than deliver a serious warning. Question 24. What lesson does the vizier want Scheherazade to learn from the tale of the bull and the ass? The vizier wants to express that meddling in matters that are beyond one's control can lead to suffering and possible death. He uses it to discourage her from risking her life by marrying Shahryar. Question 25. How do the bull and donkey represent different approaches to hardship? The bull represents honest labor and endurance, while the donkey represents cunning and avoidance of work, though his trick backfires. Question 26. What does the merchant's refusal to explain the animal conversations to his wife mean? Revealing the secret would kill him, so this demonstrates the danger of curiosity and need to accept some mysteries. Question 27. How does Shahrazad respond to the vizier's warning? What does it mean? She listens respectfully but ultimately ignores the warning, believing her own plan that telling stories to change Shahryar's heart is worth the risk. Question 28. What does the cautionary tale, The Bull and the Ass, reveal about the vizier's view of his daughter's plan? He sees it as reckless and foolish, likely to end in tragedy, and tries to dissuade her with a parable about the dangers of cleverness and interference. The authentic moral of this part of the tale is not just don't meddle. The message is much deeper. This part of the story, based on the authentic translation, reveals that wisdom must be paired with courage. The bull's naive honesty and the donkey's clever deceit both fail to produce true happiness. What we are also meant to consider is that warnings don't always prevent destiny. The vizier's attempt to deter Scheherazade shows parental fear, but Scheherazade proves that sometimes boldness is worth the risk. Another intended lesson is that transformation comes through action, not avoidance. The donkey tries to avoid hardship, but ends up suffering more. Scheherazade, in contrast, embraces the hardship path and ultimately succeeds in saving lives, as we will discover when we finish the book. So the vizier wants her to learn caution, but the reader should eventually see that Scheherazade's choice to ignore the moral of the vizier's story is what makes her heroic. Please leave your thoughts and comments down below, and thanks for listening.